What's the worst way your parents tried to control you? My parents told me to choose my N-word boyfriend or this family. I stared at them in disbelief. If you marry that gorilla, you're dead to us. No inheritance, nothing. But Michael is a doctor, I responded. He volunteers at church. He loves me. He's black, my mother said. Like that erased everything else. That's all that matters. Fine. I stood up, took off the family heirloom necklace my grandmother gave me, and set it on the table. Keep your inheritance. I choose love. What my parents didn't know was that Michael's father, William, was the CEO of the pharmaceutical company where my dad worked as regional manager for 20 years. My mom was the head of HR at their subsidiary. William had been quietly protecting them for the past 5 years. He'd buried every single complaint my father had against him. His legal team had been silently handling my mother screwing with reports, all as a favor to me, his future daughter-in-law. The Monday after I left, my father arrived at work to find his keycard deactivated. Security escorted him out with a cardboard box. Retroactive termination for creating a hostile work environment. 20 years of pension, gone. Stock options, voided. The official termination letter cited 14 incidents, all with dates, witnesses, and his own emails attached. My mother lasted until Wednesday. Federal investigators showed up with her falsified reports. She was given 2 choices. Resign immediately with no severance or face federal charges. She resigned. They had 48 hours to vacate company housing they'd been living in rent-free. Week 2 was the domino effect. Without income, they couldn't pay for their foster children's specialized therapy. The state requires proof of financial stability for foster parents. The social worker came for a routine check and found my mother day drinking at 10 a.m., my father punching holes in walls. The boys, who they'd been fostering for adoption proceedings, were removed immediately. Their church found out why they'd really been fired that same week. The pastor asked them to take a break from their leadership roles. My father had been a deacon for 15 years. My mother ran the women's ministry. Their entire social circle was through church. Suddenly, no one was returning their calls. Their Wednesday Bible study group met without them. The church harvest festival they'd organized for a decade happened with new organizers. Week 3, the financial collapse accelerated. They tried to refinance the house but couldn't without jobs. The mortgage they'd been skating on with company bonuses was suddenly impossible. My father's brother, who'd borrowed $50,000 for his business with the promise of paying it back when things improved, blocked their calls. My mother's sister, who they'd co-signed a loan for, declared bankruptcy, destroying their credit in the process. The country club canceled their membership for non-payment. My father's golf buddies, all work connections, vanished. Then the health insurance ran out. My mother's diabetes medication cost $900 a month without coverage. My father's blood pressure pills, another $400. They tried to apply for marketplace insurance, but the only available plan cost $2,000 a month with their pre-existing conditions. My mother started rationing insulin. My father stopped taking his medication entirely. Within 2 weeks, my mother was in the ER with diabetic ketoacidosis. The bill was $48,000. My father's blood pressure spiked so high he had a minor stroke in the hospital parking lot. Another $62,000. Week 4 brought the lawsuits. 3 former employees from my father's team filed discrimination suits once they heard he'd been fired. Without the company's legal protection, he was personally liable. Each suit demanded $100,000 in damages. My mother was named in a federal investigation for falsifying data. The fine was $250,000 or 5 years in prison. Their lawyer required a $50,000 retainer they didn't have. The public defender they got instead told them to prepare for the worst. The house went into foreclosure after 90 days. Their cars were repossessed the same week. My father's prized vintage Mustang he'd restored with his father was sold at auction for 1/10 of its value. They moved into my elderly grandmother's house, but she had dementia and kept calling the police reporting intruders. After the 5th false alarm, Adult Protective Services got involved. They deemed my parents exploitative for moving in and forced them to leave. They ended up in a weekly rental motel. My father got a job at a grocery store but was fired after a customer recognized him from a social media post about his termination. My mother applied to 57 jobs and got 0 callbacks. Their names were poison in the industry. The state they'd lived in for 40 years suddenly felt like enemy territory. Everyone knew what they'd done, why they'd lost everything. The racist parents who chose hate over their own daughter. 6 months later, they called me from a borrowed phone. "We're sorry," my mother sobbed. "We were wrong. Please, we need help." I remember looking over at Michael. He nodded at me. "Tell me to be there in 30. I put the phone back to my ear. Grays Avenue, Hugs Cafe, 30 minutes. I'm not waiting around. I put down the phone and me and Michael headed out the door. The drive to Grays Avenue took 15 minutes but felt like hours with my stomach doing flips the whole way. Michael kept one hand on the wheel and the other on my knee, his thumb making small circles that usually calmed me down but weren't working today. We got to Hugs Cafe 20 minutes early just like I planned, and I picked a corner table near the exit where we could see everyone coming in. The wooden chair felt cold through my jeans as I sat down facing the door. Michael went to talk to Hannah Avery, the manager we knew from coming here on weekends, and I watched him point to our table and make hand gestures that probably meant we might have drama. Hannah nodded and gave him a look that said she understood. Then she moved closer to the counter where she could keep an eye on us. I pulled out my phone and texted Celia Sterling, my therapist. Just 3 words that we'd practiced for situations like this. She texted back right away with the boundary reminder we'd gone over 100 times in her office. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold the pen when I grabbed a napkin from the dispenser. Michael came back and sat next to me instead of across, close enough that our shoulders touched. I wrote down 4 rules on the napkin in big block letters so there'd be no confusion. No racist language at all, not even hints or jokes. No blaming Michael or his family for what happened to them. No asking for money directly, or trying to guilt us into giving them cash. We leave immediately if they break any of these rules. The pen kept slipping in my sweaty fingers and my writing looked like a kid's homework. Michael took my hand under the table and squeezed it 3 times. our signal that meant everything would be okay. He leaned close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same one he'd worn on our first date, and reminded me we could walk out anytime I felt unsafe or uncomfortable. The bell above the door rang and my whole body tensed, but it was just some college kids getting coffee. Then the bell rang again 10 minutes later and there they were. My parents looked nothing like the people who'd thrown me out 6 months ago. My mother's designer clothes were gone, replaced with a faded sweater that hung loose on her smaller frame, and jeans with worn knees. Her hair that she used to get done every 2 weeks was growing out gray at the roots and pulled back in a messy ponytail. My father walked behind her with his shoulders hunched forward like he was carrying something heavy, nothing like the straight-backed man who used to command every room he entered. His golf shirt was wrinkled and had a small stain near the pocket. They spotted us and started walking over, my mother moving faster while my father dragged his feet. I gripped Michael's hand so hard under the table that my nails probably left marks. They sat down across from us and my mother's face crumpled immediately, tears running down her cheeks before she even said anything. She kept saying sorry over and over through her sobs, her hands reaching across the table toward me before pulling back. My father sat like a statue in his chair, staring at a spot on the wall behind my head. His jaw was clenched, so tight I could see the muscle jumping under his skin. I pushed the napkin with our rules across the table, the paper making a soft sliding sound against the wood. My voice came out steadier than I expected when I told them these rules weren't optional if we were going to have this conversation. My mother wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse and nodded quickly, but my father's face got red when he read them. They started talking at the same time, my mother's voice high and shaky while my father's came out rough like he hadn't used it in a while. Medical bills piling up faster than they could count them. 3 lawsuits from my father's former employees who finally felt safe to come forward. Living in a motel that cost $200 every week. Eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. My mother pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from her purse, smoothing it on the table with shaking hands. It was a list of her medications with prices written next to each one in pencil. $900 for insulin every month. $300 for her blood pressure medicine. Another $200 for anxiety medication she'd started taking. My father finally spoke directly to us, his voice cracking on the words when he admitted they needed help desperately. The proud man who'd never asked anyone for anything was sitting in front of us basically begging. I took a deep breath and told them something they didn't know, that William had been protecting them for years because of me. My father's face went from red to purple, the veins in his neck standing out. Michael stayed calm beside me, his doctor voice coming out as he explained that William simply stopped intervening after what they did. Their current situation came from their own actions finally catching up to them, not from any revenge plot. My father's hand slammed down on the table so hard the salt shaker jumped and fell over. Coffee cups at other tables stopped moving as people turned to stare at us. He accused us of orchestrating everything, destroying them on purpose out of spite. Hannah Avery started walking toward our table with her phone in her hand. I kept my voice low but firm, reminding my father that one more outburst meant we were leaving and this conversation was over forever. My mother grabbed his arm with both hands, her fingers white from gripping so tight. She begged him to calm down, please, they needed this. Then she turned to me with desperate eyes and asked if we could at least help with her insulin. Just the insulin, $900 a month, she could die without it. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I'd prepared last night when I couldn't sleep. Inside were printed pages about assistance programs, legal aid services that worked for free, medical clinics with sliding scale payments based on income. I told them I'd only help through official channels and programs, never direct cash, because I needed to protect my own boundaries and Michael's. My father pushed the folder away without looking at it, saying they needed real help, not bureaucracy and red tape. But my mother carefully picked it up and folded it small enough to fit in her purse, treating it like it was made of gold. The conversation shifted when my mother mentioned their church, how they wouldn't even let them volunteer at the food bank anymore. Her voice broke when she talked about losing that community after 15 years. Real pain showed in her eyes, different from the desperation about money. I told them Pastor Tiana Rodriguez might consider starting a restorative justice process, but only if they were willing to take real accountability for what they'd done. The words hung in the air between us like a test they had to pass. My father looked down at his coffee and muttered something under his breath about those people always sticking together, and I pushed my chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. I stood up and grabbed my purse, telling him one more racist comment meant this was over forever. No more meetings, no more help, nothing. He started backpedaling immediately, waving his hands and claiming he meant the church people who abandoned them. Not black people. But his eyes wouldn't meet mine, and we all knew exactly what he meant. Michael put his hand on my arm gently, and suggested they should start with the medical assistance programs, since health was the most urgent issue right now. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts, saying he could have a colleague send information about the manufacturer programs for insulin that could cut the cost by 70%. My father scoffed and crossed his arms, saying we were offering them crumbs while we lived in our nice house with our good jobs, but my mother reached across the table and thanked Michael, her voice shaking. I sat back down slowly and told them the next step was proving they were actually working these programs before we'd meet again. They needed to show me intake appointments scheduled, applications submitted, real documented effort, not just promises. My mother nodded quickly and pulled out a small notebook from her purse, writing everything down with a shaky hand, but my father slammed his palm on the table again. He said we were treating them like children who needed supervision, like they couldn't be trusted to handle their own lives. Hannah walked by our table again, slower this time, clearly keeping an eye on the situation. I kept my voice steady and told him this was about rebuilding trust that had been completely broken, and trust required verification now. My mother grabbed his arm again and whispered something to him about needing this help, and he finally stopped arguing, though his jaw stayed clenched tight. We all stood up to leave, the meeting clearly over, and my mother moved toward me with her arms slightly raised. She hugged me briefly, just a quick squeeze really, and whispered that she was sorry for everything, for all of it, for not standing up to him sooner. My father had already turned and was walking toward the door without looking back, without saying goodbye. without even acknowledging Michael existed. Michael and I walked to our car in silence, and the moment I sat down in the passenger seat, everything hit me at once. I started crying, not just tears but full-body shaking sobs that lasted 10 minutes while Michael held my hand and didn't say anything. 3 days passed before my mother called from the motel phone, asking if I could help her figure out the insulin manufacturer's website because she couldn't understand the forms. I opened my laptop and walked her through each page while keeping screenshots of everything, making sure there was documentation of every step we took together. She mentioned while we were filling out the income verification section that my father refused to apply for any programs at all. He'd rather die than beg for handouts, she said, and I could hear how tired she sounded, how worn down from fighting him about everything. The application required uploading bank statements and tax returns, which she had to go to the library to scan since they didn't have a computer anymore. I stayed on the phone with her for 2 hours, helping her navigate each requirement, each proof of poverty they demanded. Later that afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, it was Emmett McGregor from Williams Company. He said he needed to warn me that helping my parents directly could be seen as retaliation or manipulation, given everything that had happened with their termination. The legal department was concerned about how it might look if anyone found out the CEO's son's wife was now involved with the people they'd fired for cause. He suggested keeping any assistance at arm's length, going through third parties or official programs only, never direct transfers or personal involvement. The whole conversation made me realize how complicated this had become legally, how even trying to help them could somehow backfire on everyone. I hung up feeling more confused than before, wondering if I was making things worse by getting involved at all. The next morning I called Celia Sterling's office and booked an emergency session for that afternoon, telling the receptionist it was urgent. When I got to her office, I spent the first 20 minutes just explaining everything that had happened at the cafe. Every word, every look, every feeling. Celia helped me see that I was trying to save them now, the way I couldn't save our relationship before, trying to fix everything retroactively. We worked on separating compassion from codependency, on understanding that helping them didn't mean I had to sacrifice my own well-being or boundaries. She gave me homework to write down exactly what I was and wasn't willing to do, concrete limits I could refer back to when emotions got overwhelming. Michael decided to meet my father alone at a different coffee shop the next week, texting me that he wanted to try talking man-to-man without me there. 3 hours later, he texted me that it had been a disaster. My father had spent the entire time ranting about the injustice of his situation, the betrayal by Williams Company, how we'd destroyed his life. Michael said my father never once took responsibility for anything, just kept circling back to how he was the victim in all of this. We agreed that night that my father clearly needed way more time before he was ready for actual help, and Michael shouldn't meet with him alone again for safety reasons. 2 days after that, Pastor Tiana Rodriguez called my cell phone, saying my mother had reached out to her about possibly returning to church. She explained she was willing to facilitate some kind of reconciliation process, but only if both my parents completed specific accountability prep work first. She emailed me a list of requirements that included written acknowledgement of specific harms they'd caused, participation in anti-racism education with certified instructors, and consistent attendance at counseling for at least 3 months. The list was 3 pages long and incredibly detailed, covering everything from public apologies to the foster children's therapists, to financial restitution, to former employees they'd discriminated against. The following Monday, my mother called to tell me she'd started the intake process at an outpatient program run by someone named Alana Tillman. She sounded proud of herself, saying she was committed to getting sober, that she knew she had a problem and wanted to fix it. I told her I was proud of her for taking that step, but I made it clear I wouldn't be her accountability partner or her sponsor or her emotional support system. That's what the program was for, what Alana was for, and she needed to use those resources instead of leaning on me for everything. 2 weeks passed and I was in bed when my phone rang at midnight showing my mother's number. She was drunk, crying hard, saying she couldn't do this anymore, that she'd lost everything because she followed my dad like always. I could hear bottles clinking in the background, and her words were getting harder to understand. I hung up and called Alana's emergency line right away, gave them her location at the motel, told them about the relapse. They sent someone within the hour to check on her and adjust her treatment plan. The next morning I opened Facebook to find my dad had posted this huge rant about being destroyed by reverse racism, naming Michael's family directly, calling William a criminal who targeted white people. My coworkers started texting me screenshots, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything. The post had been shared over 200 times already. I called Jayla immediately, and she drafted a cease and desist letter that afternoon, sent it certified mail to the motel. She told me we needed to document everything now because desperate people do crazy things and we might need a restraining order soon. I started screenshotting everything, saving voicemails, keeping a log of every contact attempt. Emmett called me at work 3 days later saying the board was now reviewing all of Williams' decisions from the past 5 years, including the protection he gave my parents. He said people were asking questions about favoritism and whether William had overstepped his authority. Michael's mom was getting looks at her book club, his dad was facing extra scrutiny at every meeting. The chaos was spreading to people who only tried to help us and I felt sick about it. That night I sat at my computer and blocked my dad on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everything. I changed my phone settings so unknown numbers went straight to voicemail. I told Jayla she was the only contact point now for anything involving my father. Part of me felt relieved immediately, like I could breathe again, but another part felt like I was cutting off my own arm. A week later, Jayla called saying Pierre, my dad's court-appointed attorney, had contacted her about a subpoena. One of the discrimination lawsuits needed my deposition about things I witnessed at my dad's workplace over the years. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly what they wanted to hear about. The comments he made at company picnics, the jokes he told when he thought only family was listening, the way he talked about his black employees at dinner. I hired my own lawyer the next day, separate from the company's legal team, someone who would protect just my interests. The retainer was $5,000 and Michael wrote the check without hesitating, said we couldn't risk getting pulled into my dad's mess without proper protection. My new lawyer reviewed everything and said I'd have to tell the truth, but we could prepare so I wouldn't say more than necessary. Celia and I spent 3 sessions getting ready for the deposition, practicing how to answer questions without adding extra information or getting emotional. She taught me this breathing technique where I count to 4 on the inhale, hold for 4, exhale for 4. We practiced what to do if my dad tried to make eye contact or reacted to what I was saying. She had me write down just facts, no interpretations, no feelings, just what I saw and heard. The deposition was in this cold conference room downtown, with a court reporter typing everything. My dad sat across from me with Pierre, and I could feel him staring at me the whole time. The opposing lawyer asked about specific incidents, and I answered with just the facts. Yes, I heard him use that word. Yes, I was present when he made that comment about promotions. Yes, I saw him throw away resumes with certain names. My dad tried to interrupt once, talking about how he provided for me, paid for my college, gave me everything. Pierre grabbed his arm to stop him, and the opposing lawyer looked satisfied with every answer I gave. When it was over, Pierre looked defeated, like he knew this case was already lost. My mother called that night saying my dad wouldn't even say my name anymore, just referred to me as her, or that one. Then she started telling me things I never knew, about my grandfather being part of some group in the 60s that fought against integration, about violence he was involved in, that my dad grew up watching. She said my dad learned hate from his father, just like his father learned it from his. The pattern went back generations, but she said that didn't make it right, just helped explain it. She was sober for this call, I could tell, and she sounded tired but clear. She said she was staying with the program this time, that she had too much to lose if she didn't, even though she'd already lost most of it. I told her I was proud of her for trying and hung up before the conversation could go anywhere else. 2 days later, Pastor Tiana called me to say she was setting up a meeting with the church elders about my parents' situation. She said Dominic Sanchez and 3 other elders would be there, but my father wasn't invited since he hadn't done any of the prep work they required. I could hear papers shuffling as she explained they needed to figure out if redemption was even possible and what it would take for my parents to start that process. The meeting happened that Thursday, and Tiana called me after to say the elders were split on whether to allow my parents back at all. Dominic thought my mother might have a chance if she stayed sober and completed their accountability program, but everyone agreed my father needed serious work before they'd even consider it. That same night, Michael and I got into our first real fight about the whole situation. He came home from a long shift and found me on the phone with Alana about my mother's program, and just lost it. He said I was giving too much energy to people who called him a gorilla, and told me I was dead to them. We went back and forth for an hour with him saying I was letting them hurt me all over again, and me saying I couldn't just abandon them completely. Finally, we agreed to start weekly sessions with Vaughn Sterling, who was Celia's colleague and specialized in couples dealing with family trauma. Our first appointment was awkward with both of us sitting on opposite ends of the couch, but Vaughn helped us see we were both right in different ways. The next week, I called the clinic near my mother's motel and arranged for her insulin to be delivered there directly. Nina Sterling, who worked as a social worker at the facility, would monitor when my mother picked it up and make sure she wasn't selling it for alcohol money. I found out she'd been trading her medications for drinks at the motel, which is why I couldn't trust her with direct deliveries anymore. The arm's length approach felt cold, but Nina said it was the safest way to help without enabling. 3 weeks into this new system, my mother relapsed hard, and Alana called me at work to say she'd been found passed out in the motel parking lot. Alana recommended inpatient treatment immediately, but when we called the insurance company, they said they wouldn't cover it without proof of medical necessity beyond just addiction. The private facility wanted $30,000 up front, which I refused to pay directly. Instead, I spent the next 2 days helping my mother appeal the insurance denial through proper channels with documentation from her ER visits and Alana's treatment notes. Meanwhile, William's company board started investigating his past decisions, including the protection he'd given my parents over the years. Michael's mother called to suggest we skip family dinners until things settled down because the tension was getting unbearable. Every Sunday dinner turned into silent meals with everyone avoiding eye contact and leaving as soon as possible. The stress of being caught between 2 families both dealing with fallout from my parents' choices was wearing on all of us. Then my work situation exploded when 3 different colleagues forwarded me screenshots of my father's Facebook rants. He was calling for boycotts of my company and making wild accusations about discrimination against him. My HR representative called me in to open a formal documentation file and said they were increasing building security after someone matching my father's description was spotted in the parking garage twice that week. Hannah from Hugs Cafe reached out through Jayla to provide a written statement about my father's aggressive behavior during our meeting there. She described how he'd slammed his hand on the table and raised his voice enough that other customers looked worried, and she'd almost called the police. Jayla added this to our growing documentation file for a potential restraining order, and when I saw how thick the folder was getting, I couldn't believe this was my life now. The breaking point came when my father left 3 threatening voicemails at Michael's hospital, saying he was going to make Michael pay for destroying our family. Hospital security pulled Michael aside to play the messages and asked if we wanted to press charges. Jayla filed for an emergency protective order that same day, and it was granted within 48 hours. The police served it to my father at the motel, and the officer told him any violation meant immediate arrest with no warnings. My father apparently threw a fit and had to be restrained from going after the officer, but they let him off with a warning about that too. During all this chaos, my mother somehow managed to string together 30 days of documented sobriety with perfect attendance at her program meetings. Alana called to say my mother was asking if I'd attend a family session to work on our relationship. I agreed, but set strict conditions that Vaughn had helped me develop. The session had to happen at the facility, not some neutral location. Vaughn would attend with me as support, and we would only focus on moving forward, not rehashing the past. The session was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and I spent the whole night before practicing what I wanted to say with Michael. When we arrived at the facility, my mother was already in the room looking nervous but clear-eyed in a way I hadn't seen in months. Vaughn sat next to me while Alana sat with my mother, and we started with ground rules about respectful communication. My mother surprised me by starting with specific apologies about things she'd said and done without making excuses or trying to minimize anything. She talked about calling Michael those awful names and saying I was dead to them, and how she knew those words could never be taken back. The accountability felt real even if it wasn't complete, since she still talked about following my father's lead, like she didn't have her own choices. I told her I appreciated the effort, but that trust would take years to rebuild, if it ever could be rebuilt at all. 3 days after that session, Nina Sterling called about getting my mother into a sober living facility that had an opening but needed a $5,000 deposit within 24 hours. I drove to the program's financial office and filled out the paperwork to pay directly from my account to theirs without my mother ever touching the money. The administrator ran my card and handed me a receipt while Nina sat with my mother in the waiting room explaining the rules about curfews and mandatory group sessions and random drug tests. My mother grabbed my hand when I walked past and squeezed it hard enough that her nails left marks, but I kept walking because I couldn't handle her crying right then. 2 weeks into the sober living arrangement, my phone rang at 3 in the morning with a nurse saying my father was in the cardiac unit after his blood pressure hit 220/140, and he'd listed me as emergency contact. Michael drove us to the hospital where we met a security guard at the entrance who walked us to the cardiac wing because of the restraining order situation. My father looked small in the hospital bed with monitors beeping and tubes running everywhere, and when he saw us, he started talking about how this was all our fault for destroying his life. The nurse checked his vitals while he ranted about losing everything because of us, and Michael stood by the door ready to leave if things got bad. My father's voice cracked when he mentioned his own father used to take him to meetings where they talked about keeping races separate and how that was just normal back then. I told him being taught wrong didn't mean he couldn't learn right, and at 62 years old he had no excuse for not figuring that out himself. He turned his face to the wall and wouldn't look at me again, so we left after signing the paperwork confirming I'd been notified. Pierre Jacobson called the next morning to tell us one of the discrimination lawsuits was settling for $75,000 that my father didn't have, which meant bankruptcy was coming. The lawyer explained the process would wipe out remaining debts, but also any assets, though at this point my father had nothing left to protect anyway. I felt weird hearing about his financial destruction, like watching someone who worshipped money lose every penny of it. Pastor Tiana reached out that afternoon proposing a restorative justice circle where my father could face the employees he'd hurt, but only after completing an intensive anti-racism program first. She sent over the requirements, which included weekly sessions for 6 months, plus reading assignments and community service specifically focused on understanding systemic racism. My father apparently agreed to start the program, but Dominic Sanchez called me privately 2 days later, saying the background check turned up my father's recent activity in online supremacist forums. My father claimed he was just venting frustration about his situation, but the posts went way beyond that into actual hate speech and threats. Dominic said they couldn't move forward with any church reconciliation until my father completely cut ties with those groups and showed real change, not just surface compliance. I had Jayla send my father a formal letter stating my one condition for any future relationship was that he publicly disavow his racist views and the online hate groups. The letter made it clear this wasn't negotiable, and without it I would never attend any reconciliation attempt no matter what else he did. 3 days later, my father posted a statement online saying he'd made mistakes and said things in anger that he regretted, but never once mentioned race or racism or the specific things he'd done. The comments section exploded with people calling him out for the weak non-apology, and screenshots of his hate forum posts started circulating again. Pastor Tiana called to say he clearly wasn't ready, and suggested we focus on my mother's progress instead since she was actually doing the work. The restorative circle moved forward the following week with just my mother meeting 2 former employees she'd discriminated against at the company. I watched through a window as she sat across from them listening to how her actions affected their careers and families without interrupting or making excuses. She nodded and took notes and apologized for specific incidents they brought up, though she stopped short of acknowledging the bigger pattern of systemic discrimination she'd participated in. One of the employees cried, talking about how my mother had blocked her promotion 3 times with made-up performance issues, and my mother's face went white hearing the real impact. After 2 hours they finished, and my mother looked exhausted, but also somehow lighter, like she'd put down something heavy she'd been carrying. Alana called me that evening to discuss next steps, and I made it clear I wasn't ready for direct reconciliation, but would agree to monthly check-ins with professional mediation. We scheduled the first one for the following month at a neutral counseling center with both Alana and Vaughn present to keep things structured and safe. The boundaries felt right because they let me stay protected while still leaving a tiny door open for the possibility that my mother might actually change. Michael supported the decision, though he made it clear he wouldn't be attending these sessions, and I respected that boundary too since my family had targeted him specifically with their hate. 2 weeks passed before Dominic called to tell me my mother had started working at the church thrift store sorting donations in the back room where she wouldn't interact with customers yet. He watched her show up every morning at 8 sharp and work until 2 without complaint, even when they had her cleaning bathrooms and taking out trash. The small paycheck barely covered her expenses at the sober living facility, but she thanked him every Friday like he'd given her $1 million. I drove by once just to see if it was real, and spotted her through the window organizing clothes by size with the same focus she used to apply to destroying people's careers. That same afternoon, Emmett called from William's company to update us on the board investigation that had been hanging over everyone's heads for months. William got hit with a formal censure for overstepping his authority, but they let him keep his position with new oversight requirements and monthly reviews of his decisions. The relief in Emmett's voice told me how close it had come to being worse, but the damage was already done to family relationships. Michael's parents invited us to dinner that weekend at their favorite Italian place, and the tension started before we even sat down. His mother kept stirring her wine without drinking it while his father studied the menu like it contained state secrets. Nobody mentioned the investigation, or my parents, or anything that mattered until halfway through the main course when his mother finally put down her fork and said we needed to separate family from business going forward. Michael agreed immediately and suggested monthly dinners with a strict no-work talk rule, which his parents accepted with visible relief. 3 days later, my mother called through Nina at the facility to ask if I'd co-sign her application for subsidized housing since she'd maintained steady employment for a month. I drove to the housing office and provided verification of her employment status, but refused to put my name on any financial documents, which Nina helped my mother understand was actually better for both of us. My mother nodded and filled out the paperwork herself, while I watched from across the room, remembering when she used to forge documents without blinking. The next morning, my phone rang at 5 with my father screaming about needing $3,000 for a bankruptcy lawyer immediately. I hung up and texted him the same legal aid resources I'd sent twice before, which triggered a voicemail so full of rage that Jayla added it to our restraining order file within an hour. Pierre called later to apologize for my father's behavior and confirm the bankruptcy filing would proceed with or without private counsel. 2 days after that, my workplace security called to say my father was in the lobby demanding to see me despite the protective order. The police arrived within 10 minutes and issued him a formal warning that the next violation meant automatic arrest with no bond until trial. The officer who took my statement mentioned that most people need to actually get arrested before they understand boundaries are real. I sat in Celia's office the following week going through my symptom checklist and realizing I'd slept through the night 4 times that week without nightmares. My shoulders didn't automatically tense when my phone rang anymore, and I'd gone 3 whole days without checking over my shoulder in parking lots. She pointed out that healing wasn't a straight line, but my trajectory was clearly upward, which was all anyone could ask for after this kind of trauma. The facility called to invite me to my mother's 6-month sobriety celebration, and I agreed to attend for exactly 20 minutes with Michael. We arrived to find her surrounded by other residents singing some recovery song while she held a little plastic chip like it was made of gold. I handed her a card with a simple message about being proud of her work, and she mouthed, "Thank you," while tears ran down her face. Michael and I left without hugging her, but the eye contact felt like progress compared to 6 months ago. Pastor Tiana worked behind the scenes for weeks to get the church board to approve my mother returning as a regular member with strict behavioral agreements. She could attend services and Bible study, but couldn't hold any leadership positions or work with money or have access to member information. The Sunday she returned, several people moved to different pews, but enough stayed that she had someone to sit with. Alana called it crucial for sustained recovery to have community beyond just the treatment facility. Meanwhile, my father finished his court-mandated anger management program and submitted his completion certificate to the Restorative Justice Committee. Dominic pulled me aside after reviewing the report to share his concerns that my father was just going through the motions without any real internal change. The therapist's notes mentioned consistent deflection and blaming others, even in the final session. We scheduled a follow-up evaluation in 3 months to reassess whether he was ready for any kind of reconciliation process. Michael and I sat at our kitchen table that evening with a calendar spread between us, picking a date 3 months out for our courthouse ceremony. We wanted something small and quiet, just his parents and maybe 5 or 6 friends who'd supported us through everything. I called the courthouse the next morning to book the slot and paid the $75 fee over the phone. Michael made dinner reservations at a nice restaurant for after, nothing fancy, just a place we liked downtown. 2 weeks before the wedding, I wrote identical letters to both my parents, printing them on regular paper and addressing the envelopes to their counselors. The letter to my mother said she could attend if she stayed sober, brought Nina as her sponsor, and sat in the back row without approaching other guests. The letter to my father explained that due to safety concerns and the protective order, he wasn't invited, but I'd send photos afterward. I dropped both letters at the post office on a Tuesday morning, getting delivery confirmation for both. Alana called me 3 days later saying my mother had read the letter during their session and accepted all the conditions without argument. Pierre left a voicemail that same afternoon saying my father had torn up his letter and thrown it in the trash while yelling about being excluded. The morning of our wedding arrived with perfect spring weather, and I put on a simple white dress I'd bought at Nordstrom Rack for $90. Michael wore his best suit, the one he usually saved for medical conferences, and we drove to the courthouse together holding hands. His parents were already waiting outside with our friends. Everyone dressed nice but casual. Nobody making a big deal about things. I spotted my mother sitting on a bench near the entrance with Nina beside her, both wearing simple dresses and keeping their distance like we'd agreed. The ceremony took 15 minutes in a wood-paneled room with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs. The judge read the standard vows, we exchanged rings we'd bought online for $200 each, and Michael added his own line about choosing love over fear every single day. I saw my mother wiping her eyes with a tissue Nina handed her, but she stayed in her seat and didn't try to approach us. After signing the papers, we walked out married, our small group clapping and taking pictures with their phones. My mother stood up as we passed, mouthing congratulations, before sitting back down, and I nodded at her once before we left for the restaurant. The next morning, I printed our best wedding photo at CVS and wrote 2 identical notes saying this was for their information only, not an invitation for contact. I included updated lists of resources for housing assistance, medical programs, and job placement services I'd researched online. Both envelopes went out in that afternoon's mail with no return address, just the photo and information, nothing personal. 3 weeks later, Pierre called to inform me my father had accepted a warehouse job in Arizona, loading trucks for minimum wage plus overtime. The move violated his agreement to stay local for legal proceedings, but the court approved it since he'd shown up for all required appearances so far. The distance meant no more surprise visits to my workplace or angry encounters at the grocery store. My father sent one final email before leaving, saying he hoped I was happy destroying his life, which Jayla immediately added to our documentation file. Meanwhile, my mother had been working with the housing program for months, finally getting approved for a subsidized studio apartment downtown. Nina helped her move in with donated furniture from the church, setting up her medications in a weekly pill organizer on the kitchen counter. The apartment was tiny, just 300 square feet, but it was hers and she could afford it on her thrift store wages. She sent me a photo through Alana of her new place. Everything neat and organized, her sobriety chips displayed on a little shelf. We started meeting for coffee once a month at a park halfway between our places, always on Saturday mornings when it was busy with families and dog walkers. We'd sit on the same bench by the pond, talking about her job sorting donations or my latest project at work, never mentioning my father or the past. She'd drink black coffee from the cart while I had tea, and we'd watch the ducks for exactly 1 hour before going our separate ways. The conversation stayed surface level, discussing the weather or a book she was reading for her recovery group. nothing deeper. After 6 months of these meetings, I could see real changes in her. Not just the sobriety, but actual understanding of what she'd done. She never asked for more time or pushed boundaries, just showed up when we agreed and left when the hour was up. Looking back now at everything that happened over this year, I can see how justice came in small, messy pieces rather than one big dramatic moment. My mother crawled toward accountability one day at a time, while my father stayed stuck in his anger 3 states away. I learned that loving someone doesn't mean saving them from consequences, and sometimes the best thing you can do is protect your own peace while letting people face what they've created. Appreciate you hanging out with me through all this. I've still got a ton of questions, but hey, that's just how my brain works. I'll see you around next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.